In this episode, we kick off our Road to Draft Day 2024 content with a deep dive on probably the least important position of the lot, the goalkeepers. Welcome back to the Draft FC podcast, a podcast, website and YouTube channel dedicated to all things official FPL. My name is Mitch, I'm your host for the first proper episode in our Road to Draft Day 2024 series with a positional look at the goalkeepers. Now, as I said in the intro to the intro, probably the least important position, but as every year, it's the first one I start to prep, and so naturally I get carried away and I end up doing far too much work on a position that I'm about to tell you again and again isn't very important. But if you're watching this, if you follow along at Draft FC, possibly if you're a member on the site, then this is the kind of stuff really that hopefully you live for. So as I said, this will kick things off for a short run of pods as part of our Road to Draft Day 2024 series, looking at each position in turn. Goalkeepers today, followed up soon by the defenders, the mids, and finally the forwards. Now, my draft rankings are very much taking shape now and are available to view for all of those signed up members who have got a preseason pack at draftfc.co.uk. Now, our site is geared up to support you right now, right through to Game Week 38 waiver deadline. But I know for many of you, you just want some extra support on draft day. So if that's you, I'd steer you towards checking out the site and having a look at just getting the pre-season pack. What that allows you to get is full access to the draft room and anything else that might be helpful to you before Game Week 1 for just a small one-off fee. This then gives you, as I said, a full month of access. So if you signed up fairly late into August, that month may include some of the Game Week deadlines. And so you might get a peek into what the site does for you once the season is up and running proper. But for now, you'll be able to see our draft ranks in full. We also put the official FPL ranks in there just as a point of comparison. And then the other big thing we do is that every single day we curate all of the drafts that are happening worldwide, distill that into that table so that for each player you can see the average position that they're being drafted worldwide. And obviously the more the summer rolls on, with every day more drafts are happening and that data becomes more and more accurate towards where everyone thinks each player should go. Last year, there were a couple of small glitches which we've managed to iron out now. So having the Draft FC dashboard open during your draft live in a separate tab or window should now work absolutely fine. You'll see as each player is selected by you or other managers, that will be marked off on the draft board, so you'll know exactly who's there and who's not there. It'll also show you very simply who the free players are that haven't yet been picked up by anybody. That's about as far as the functionality is going to go this year, which I still think is really useful. I know a few of you have reached out and sort of talking about something a little bit more automatic that's kind of feeding you the next selection. That's not what we're going to do for now. There's a part of me that doesn't like the idea of doing that, but I know as our functionality improves, that's probably going to be somewhere that we do look to go. But for now, I quite like just being able to clearly highlight who's coming and who's going based off of our draft ranking, and still allowing you to then have some freedom to pick yourselves. I know some people will do their rankings in tiers. So again, just by looking at our rankings, you'll be able to see the kind of next bracket of players that are free basically becomes a tier. And so it gives you that flexibility to select who you want depending on your biases and who you might have already put in your team up to that point. The other small addition, but I think very useful thing that we've added to the draft rankings this year is my ability to assign a risk score to each player, so low, medium or high, which you'll see alongside the rankings in the site. So a player rumoured to possibly be on their way out with a poor injury track record could be flagged high risk, and sort of explain why they may be slightly lower in the rankings than you might think they are, or even slightly higher in the rankings than you think they are, depending on some potential moves. So this isn't to put you off an individual player. As I say, hopefully it's just another little thing to help explain, and also during the live draft, potentially something that you can note, because if you kind of notice that you've drafted 4 or 5 rounds and you've got 3 or 4 medium to high risk players on there, it might just steer your eye away from other higher risk players for the rest of your team. So it's, say, something we're trialing this season. You can let us know afterwards how useful you found it. Happy to explain any marks of high or medium risk for those that have had a look and not sure. So feel free to DM me and I'll happily explain them. But really, and I'm tweaking those all of the time, similar to the rankings. So if some strong rumours come out that a player's about to go, as well as nudging them down the rankings, I'll also increase their risk score just to reflect that too. Now, if you're already a member, you can use the promo code MEMBERDRAFTROOM, all one word, to get the preseason access for just $9.99. So if you're on a monthly subscription, you won't automatically get the preseason access. That's a separate thing. But say if you are a member, use that code MEMBERDRAFTROOM and you'll get that for just $9.99. Another thing to point out for existing members, which we sort of set up towards the end of last year, is the refer a friend feature, which we've just given a bit of a summer boost to. So previously, towards the back end of last season, if you referred a friend, you'd get £2 credit in your Draft FC account, which would come off your subscriptions. Currently, we've increased that to £5. So for every friend you refer, your account will be credited £5, which will then come off your future subscription costs. So the way that works is you simply input your friend's email address, send them the link, and if they sign up using that link, then you'll get £5 credited to your account. And there is no limit to how many friends you can refer. So if you refer 2 friends, you'll get £10. If you refer 10 friends, you'll get £50. Not only do you get that kickback from us, but the friend that you refer will get 50% off for 3 months, and that 50% will also include a discount off the pre-season pack should they choose to choose it. So win-win all round. But as I said, for this episode, we are going to get the positional breakdowns started with a look at the goalkeeper position. Now, I like spending the extra time on the goalkeepers now because really, if we set ourselves up well on draft day, it should be an area that doesn't really need to be adjusted at all during the season. And instead, we can focus our energies on the other outfield positions on draft day and for the rest of the season as a whole. Because let's face it, as I'll hopefully convince you again in this season's goalkeeper episode, the goalkeeper position has the lowest impact on your eventual success or failure come the end of the season. Similar with my philosophy on draft day as a whole, that you can't win the league on draft day, but you can certainly lose it. So echoes the same sentiment with the goalkeepers, the 2 goalkeepers that you end up selecting. I think this is especially true in small and average-sized draft leagues. You can probably put your foot in it a little bit more if you're in a 16-team league, for example. But even, say, in my 11-team league last year, one manager managed to draft 2 non-starting goalkeepers, which obviously creates a massive headache, and they're then having to rummage around in the waivers for a goalkeeper to emerge that's going to play week in, week out. But say for most leagues out there, we know the most popular league size are 8-team leagues, between 8 and 10. There's no excuse why every manager shouldn't be able to have 2 starting goalkeepers. And hopefully, as I'll convince you as this episode progresses, I think having a reasonably average rotating pair should quite comfortably set you up to perform just as well or even outperform having one of the so-called premium goalkeepers. So let's have a look to last preseason. Let's rewind the clock 12 months when we were preparing for last year. So the main change that I made last preseason was focusing on optimal goalkeeper pairings rather than simply ranking them individually. This process really, in my eyes, was created and solidified by work done by FPLDraft strategy. And I'll put a link to his Twitter feed below because he's done an updated version of this for this season too, with a nice thread in there, in which he created a spreadsheet of which you can see the kind of output table or similar to what the output table would have been on the screen now. And what that's doing really is pairing up each team's goalkeepers and working out how difficult those fixtures would be if you rotated them well over the course of the season. Now, despite there being some better pairings on paper, my main preseason tip last year was to try and get Bernd Leno, as he had a number of very good pairing options to provide you with good flexibility during the actual live draft process itself. So hypothetically, if Ederson and Alisson had come out as the best pairing, it's fairly unrealistic to be able to grab both of those on draft day. Whereas if you picked up Leno, he rotated really nicely with Martinez, Flecken, Areola, Pickford, who you should have much more easily been able to grab as your second keeper. Now, the optimal pair last year was Vicario and Flecken, a pairing that I managed to get in my main draft league, which didn't really turn out to be quite the diamond duo that I'd hoped. Now, the table that you can see on screen is actually a table that I've created after game week 38, which is looking at all the points each goalkeeper scored week to week, and showing us if you had these two teams' goalkeepers and if you rotated them perfectly all season, so if you benched the inferior keeper every single week, how many points could you squeeze out of the goalkeeping position? Now, Pickford alone was the top scoring goalkeeper. He scored 153. But as you can see from the table, if you were able to select Pickford in conjunction with Onana for Man United, that's that nice red 219, then you could, in theory, have got 219 points from your goalkeeper position. That's assuming you just kept those from game week 1 right through to game week 38. Obviously, you could complicate things. You could have brought in Muric for the end of the season and maybe squeeze a few more points out of that as a season total. But in terms of just drafting two keepers on draft day, rotating them perfectly, Everton's and Man United's pair would have given you the highest yield. So let's quickly just look at how the keepers performed last year. So obviously Pickford was the highest on 153, and then Raya was behind on 135, and then Leno and Onana scored 133. They were the top scoring keepers, so we're not talking massive numbers there. 5 keepers were ever present, started all 38 league games: Pickford, Leno, Onana, Kaminsky and Vicario. Honorary mention to Flecken, who missed just one start, I think because he was unwell. If we just focus on Pickford very quickly, let's say pre-season optimal pairing options were Alisson or Leno, and if you got either of those combos, you were set up fairly well for success with your goalkeepers. He was 7th in terms of expected goals conceded, which was 56, but he only let in 51. 7th in terms of overall saves with 121, and as a point of interest, Man United's Onana had 149, so he led the way. 2nd overall in terms of clean sheets, which is probably the biggest factor here, with 13, which is 3 less than Raya, who finished with 16. Only Ederson and Leno as individual keepers managed to get into double digits last season. Pickford led the way in bonus points, got 22 for the season. The average starting goalkeeper in the Premier League last year collected around 9, so he was sort of more than double what the average keeper was picking up. And he managed to do that despite 0 penalty saves and also 1 own goal over the season. Also got 5 yellows, which is the joint highest of the goalkeepers, and still managed to keep his points tally at the top. So really, it's not rocket science. Pickford's success boiled down to a healthy number of clean sheets, a healthy number of saves, and a healthy number of bonus points. So, as I've already pointed to already, this table was done after the end of the season, if you made the optimal decision every week. Now, that's obviously a challenge bordering on impossible, but it still gives us an idea of where the best scores were most likely to come from. Or does it? I mean, we'll come on to that in a minute. But as I said, in the table, red is high, so red is good, green is low, green is bad. The obvious red cross you can see there coincides with Pickford's contribution for Everton. So pretty much any pairing you would have had with Pickford, even pairing him with the worst, which was Nottingham Forest keeper, or keepers, would have, an optimal combo would have still outscored Pickford alone and outscores the majority of actual goalkeeper totals most of us will have managed to actually get in reality last year. So as I mentioned, the best pairing on there is Pickford and Onana, 219 points. Just as a point of interest, if you were to rotate them in the worst possible way, i.e. if you were benching your best goalkeeper option every week, that same combo would score you just 67 points for the season. So as such, I thought, well, why not look at that for all of these pairings? So if I move this on, this is exactly the same table, but basically the opposite end of the scale. So rather than the optimal pairing, this would have been, if you benched your best goalkeeper every single week, how many points would you still manage to have scored over the course of the season? It's actually quite a staggering, I think, point of interest. So again, red is high, so red is good, and green is low. I think it's quite staggering. If you look at the Raya-Pickford pairing, assuming that you benched the wrong keeper every single week of the season, you'd have still managed 94 points from your goalkeeper position. Now, I guarantee you, and I haven't looked at the numbers, but I could do, there will have been people in draft leagues up and down, well, all over the world, who would have been trying to play their heart out every single week and barely managed to improve on 94 points. So that was a really big flaw. And what that did, obviously, and that's not coinciding with the highest pairing, which was Pickford and Onana. As you can see, the Everton and Man United, where those coincide, you could have feasibly got as low as 67 points from that pairing. So the floor is a lot lower. So this got me thinking a bit more, and I realised what I could do with the two tables that you've already seen is work out a mean score, an average score, as if you kind of rotated them at random. So this could then act as, in my mind, a better baseline for that rotation, with a sort of an expectation that an engaged manager paying attention to fixtures and form should hopefully score higher than that baseline. And this probably also reflects the reality of FPL goalkeepers better, as it tightens the pack a lot more with a far smaller range between the best and worst pairings, a nod to the fact that it's really difficult to really mess up your goalkeeper selections on draft day unless you select keepers that don't play. And another reason why investing in them too highly on draft day is unwise. So let's have a look at that table. So again, same idea as the two tables you've already seen. Red is good, green is bad. And what we can see here, by averaging out, actually the best pairing comes out at Pickford and Raya, which makes sense. They were the two highest scoring keepers in the game, so reflective of the fact that the floor was a lot higher. Pickford and Onana comes out just below that at 143, but you can see the numbers generally are a lot tighter. So these are kind of, if you look at any two, if you match up any two row and column, that's kind of a random average baseline score you should expect if you have those two goalkeepers all season. Looking at our draft day data on Draft FC from last year for 10-team leagues, Ederson was the highest drafted goalkeeper with an average draft day pick of 43rd, 43 overall. Alisson wasn't far behind at 46, and Pope was up at 53. Compare that to Pickford and Leno, who were drafted at picks 111 and 116 respectively, so right at the back end dregs of the draft, sort of 12th, 13th rounders. Essentially, you can't really make a case for reaching for any goalkeeper when you look at the value you'd have found in the final rounds of the draft. This is a lesson that only holds more weight the smaller your draft is. My stats are looking at 10-team leagues. If you're in an 8-team league or fewer, there's really no excuse for jumping on a goalkeeper, potentially before the 12th or 13th round. The only reason this could change is if you find yourself at the end of a run of keepers, but even then, it would have to be under fairly unique circumstances that you go jumping the gun, certainly in rounds 1 to 10, in my opinion. With Draft FC's analytics section, we're able to see how many points you and your league rivals managed to score by each position. So in my 11-team league last year, the highest points tally that a single manager got from their goalkeeper position was 165. Which is phenomenal. Guess who the goalkeeper combination was? It was Pickford and Onana. Now, the optimal score, as I said, was up in the heady heights of 219. So 165 means that manager scored 75% of the potential yield that they could have got from that pairing, which from studying various leagues, both this year and in recent years, let me tell you, that is a decent score. That score is also 20 more points above the average score you can see reflected on the screen now, which was 143, which in my mind is probably a better metric to measure against. Contrast that with my pairing, who I said I sat smugly with at the end of draft day last summer, Vicario and Flecken. Their optimal score, if rotated perfectly, is just 164. Now, I managed to squeeze just 123 points, which again is exactly 75% of the value that you could expect. It's just the pairing fundamentally was nowhere near as good as predicted. The mean score for that rotation was 116, so I mildly outperformed this, which again is why I think it's a better metric to measure against. So probably, again, supports my own sign, my own gut feeling that I rotated them generally quite badly, especially at the beginning of the season. The lowest goalkeeper score in our league was 100 points for the season, which came from the same draft day manager I mentioned at the beginning, who picked up Ramsdale and Fabianski on draft day. So both obviously not number one last year, and so of course that manager had to dip into the waiver pile several times in order to find starting keepers, meaning we can't really accurately work out the potential there, and I'm not going to trawl through 38 game weeks to check, but really the main moral of that story is get starting goalkeepers. in the 10-team Content Creator League that's now been running for 2 years and will be running for its third year this summer now, this year's league winner Jay had the highest goalkeeping score with 157. He made a few goalkeeper waivers at points during the season, so it's not the easiest to sort of compare against, but it's probably fair to list him as Raya and Pope with a potential of around 189 points, and then so his 157 is a derivative of about 83% of the potential, which is very good. Also well above the average rotation score that you can see on screen between Arsenal and Newcastle of 133. So, we're talking not massive swings. The difference in your goalkeepers between the best and worst could be 30 points. We're talking maybe less than 1 point a week over a 38-game week season. But if you're consistently behind enough, those small points, as I'm sure you're well aware, can be all the difference between winning a head-to-head matchup and losing one. So let's look ahead then to this upcoming season, 24-25. And that little elephant there is just a reminder for me in a minute to acknowledge the elephant in the room. So Preseason pairing ranks was able to highlight some decent scoring pairs in hindsight, but I say it's easy to cherry pick some examples that fit. The two best pairs were Pickford and Nana and Pickford and Raya. These were only slightly above average pairings on the preseason table, and so they didn't stand out enough to highlight. These wouldn't have been pairings that you'd have heard us shouting about. Now, obviously, if you came away on draft day with Pickford and Nana, nobody would have told you that was bad, but it certainly wasn't something that the preseason analysis last year would have been really steering you towards. And if you'd have picked up Raya first, for example, that table would have steered you to 10 better options than Pickford. So what I did was I put those preseason numbers against the final tally of FPL points. So I plotted them side by side on a scatter graph, which you can see on screen now, and then measured the correlation between those. Now, visually, if you ignore that trend line for a second and just take a step back, you'll see straight away there is no obvious correlation between the two data sets. The dots are fully scattered all over the place. And this is backed up with a very low correlation coefficient of just 0.18. Now, if we were accurately predicting scores, accurately predicting good and bad rotations, we should see a trend in the data points from the top left-hand side down to the bottom right-hand side of the graph. Now, the trend line shows a slight tilt in that direction, but certainly not enough to really draw any sort of inferences from that. So, does that mean that really that strategy doesn't have any mileage in it, and should we be using that same idea again this season? I think there is still plenty of mileage in that idea to try again this summer. And at Draft SC, we're probably going to do one major change, which I'll come on to in a second. Now, the pre-season table that FPL Draft Strategy did last year was more or less built on assigning teams a number between 1 and 10 to indicate their strength. So City were given a score of 10, Sheffield and Luton were given a score of 1. This was done, if memory serves, somewhat subjectively, with very little modelling to back up those numbers. So obviously this method of projecting pairs and seeing what the optimal rotation is will really only be as good as the suppositions that it's built on. So a universal rule was applied for home advantage 2, just to deduct 1 from the opposition attacking value. But again, this could have been done or could be done with a lot more finesse. So one of the things that Draft FC this time last year didn't quite have up and running was a functional expected points model. Now, we did get that going during the season, and that is undergoing huge changes this summer. And as we speak, this has obviously been a really steep learning curve for us, and a journey I expect we'll carry on with for many more years to come, so long as we're doing this, fine-tuning our assumptions to come up with a model that we're happy with. This summer, we've added far more data points. Now, more data doesn't always equal more accuracy, but we think we've got enough to make the algorithm a lot better. We've also used some AI machine learning to kind of cheat our way to find the relevant data points that most strongly correlate with ultimate FPL points performance. So last year we were sort of crudely trying to model clean sheets, wasn't factoring in saves, bonus points, yellow cards, etc. What our new model should be able to do is kind of rudimentally model from game week 1 to game week 38 for each goalkeeper how many FPL points we think they will score each game week. So this will take into account the strength of opposition, the styles of play, because we're looking at shot volumes and things like that. So it also factor in home and away, of course. So rather than the artificial kind of 10-point scale used last year, hopefully do it with a lot more accuracy. Map those FPL point predictions onto the tables like you've seen already, and then basically come up with some far better pairings. Now, that will be coming as soon as the expected points model is finalised, or at least version 1 is finalised, which will be any time in the next 48 hours. I will then quickly put that table together, and that table will be available to view in the draft room for members at Draft FC. So I'm expecting that to be there for you to see by Tuesday at the latest. What will that be? Tuesday the 30th of July. So keep your eyes peeled for that. Now, I haven't forgotten the elephant in the room, how could we? Which is the big change to FPL this year, which is the bonus point system tweaks. I'm sure you've all seen it and are aware. It doesn't take an expert mathematician to work out that the changes will negatively impact goalkeepers and defenders and will provide more avenues for bonus points for attacking players. Now, within hours, a number of FPL content creators, probably the ones who are able to do fantasy football full-time, had the numbers from last year with the new bonus point rules factored in to see who the winners and losers were. And say no surprises really that goalkeepers were high up on the list of losers. Muric consistently comes out as the biggest loser, basically losing all 12 of his bonus points, with the likes of Martinez, Neto, Vicario, Alisson, Pickford, also high up on the losers list. Muric had a slightly unique data set, but for the majority, we're talking about the loss, equivalent loss of around 6 points over the entire season. So we're not talking huge numbers. That's 6 points over 38 game weeks, but big enough that, I say, it could make the difference in 1 or 2 head-to-head matchups over the year. Possibly, but, I would say think of somebody like Vicario, who got 7 clean sheets last season. Is it inconceivable? Could you foresee now that Spurs go from keeping 7 clean sheets this year to 8 clean sheets? And if that's the case, then he would make up that loss in bonus points in one game. So I don't think it's going to really change a huge amount for keepers. As I say, it just keeps them pegged back slightly. But I think what it does do really is just adds another nail in their coffin further down the draft board, and potentially further down the draft board than many draft managers and many new draft managers will be comfortable with. Now, as I've alluded to already, one of the biggest things to consider are personnel headaches. Who is going to be the starting number 1 for each club? Because you could do all of the work in the world and think that Crystal Palace are going to keep 20 clean sheets next season, but if you draft the wrong starting goalkeeper, you ain't going to get any credit for it. Now, of course, again, the maths gets tight as you play in larger and larger leagues. So if you're in a 16-team draft league, there's a real good chance that there's going to be one of those 16 managers, maybe 2, who end up drafting 1 or 2 keepers that don't start. And there's no way that it's going to be physically possible for all 16 to get 2 starting keepers. So many of them will have to rely on handcuffing 2 keepers from the same club, which isn't a bad way to do things. It's not my preference based on all of the data that I've already covered. I think you're far better off with a good rotating pair from 2 clubs, but certainly in like a 14, 15, 16 team league, if you ended up with Edison, Ortega, Alisson, Kelleher, even some Johnston and Henderson for Palace, then at least that's a safe way into a starting goalkeeper each week. Last summer seemed particularly tricky with possible selection headaches. We had issues at Arsenal, obviously, with Ramsdale getting usurped by Raya. Brighton, we had no clue who was going to start, and that basically didn't change all season. Same with Brentford, West Ham, Palace, Burnley, Forest. Let's say Ramsdale ended up being drafted higher than Raya last season, and what a swing that decision was if you ended up with him over David Raya. This season, it feels like things are a bit more settled. There are still a few teams with number 1s to be resolved, and I've basically put the club badges on the screen now. Brighton without De Zerbi should, I would imagine, finally settle on 1 starting keeper. Now, Verbruggen is injured for the first few weeks of the season, so still will get a chance to audition for the number 1 spot. If I had to guess now, I would probably guess Verbruggen becomes the number 1 there, but it's probably a draft day headache I'm going to stay away from. Chelsea's new manager has to decide between Sanchez or bringing in a new signing. It seems that they are intent on bringing in Jorgensen from Villarreal. Hopefully we have some clarity on that in the coming days before draft day. If they are bringing in a new keeper for estimated around 20 million euros, hard to see how he's not given a shout at number 1, or he could just look on doing the classic, just waiting for the starting keeper to make his first mistake and have his first game and then switches in. Again, the Chelsea keeper situation is probably something I'm going to stay away from. Palace need to choose between Johnston and Henderson. I've done a lot of trawling through forums and looking at the data and things. I mean, they seem to poll reasonably similarly in terms of data. Palace fans don't seem to have a real clear indication of who the number one is. Johnston's probably edging it and would edge it for me. If we get some clarity on that, I think the Palace goalkeeper position could be a really valuable one this year. But again, as it stands, it's probably another place I'm going to steer away from. But if I had to, I would go Johnston for now. And Nottingham Forest have God knows how many keepers on their books at the moment. It's still unclear whether the new signing Carlos Miguel, all 6 for 8 of him, will be the number one in game week 1. I think he probably will be, but again, I would need to see more pre-season and some just general press conference evidence to suggest otherwise. But again, I'd steer away from there. Now, not one that would be on a lot of people's radars, but Bournemouth are also ones to watch, in my opinion. Neto was very poor last season. It's complicated because he's a club captain, so probably slightly more difficult to drop. But I think if he starts the season poorly, he's going to struggle to hang on to that number one spot. They've brought in a young New Zealand goalkeeper in Paulson, who's got some good pedigree to him, but doesn't really have a lot of experience at this level. But I feel like they could be tempted to make that change sooner rather than later. So again, it's another goalkeeper that I'm going to steer away from. So as I've said already, the full list of draft rankings, and I ranked 240 players on the assumption that a manager drafting in a 16-team draft league can have a look at those. So that's 32 keepers, 80 defenders, 80 mids, and 48 forwards. But what I will be doing in these positional videos is going through kind of a random selection of players at various points in my rankings and actually telling you where I've got them on my list as it stands and why. I'll say for most leagues, most average size leagues between 8 and 12, be aggressively late with when you take your first goalkeeper. You know, if you overreach for a goalkeeper and take a goalkeeper, let's say in round 6, by that time, it's highly unlikely you will have, filled out 3 mids and 3 forwards. If you haven't got all of your forwards and you are taking a goalkeeper, the calibre of forward that you can then pick up in the following round just falls off a cliff. And you'll notice it soon in the draft. I mean, you'll notice the drop-off in forwards after round 2. And then once people start picking up their second goalkeepers, the drop-off around round 5 is vast as well. And panic can very quickly set in. So a general rule of thumb would be if you haven't got 3 forwards in your squad, don't pick your goalkeeper. So I'm always wary of being too prescriptive over it and setting hard and fast rules because every draft is different and sometimes you just have to roll with the punches and there could be a whole run of goalkeepers that disappear and you just have to take one at risk of not getting a couple of starters. But I think for those average size leagues, you've got to be in round sort of 12 plus potentially and just take the best goalkeeper available, match him up with a good pair based on our rotation table, and you're sorted. If you want individual ranks, as I say, I do have the goalkeepers ranked in the list of players overall. Raya remains my top individual goalkeeper target. The area he's in at the moment is still in quite a lot of flux, but he would sit around 90th out of the 240 players that I have ranked as a total list. I'll say again, most well-rotated pairs will outperform any premium goalkeeper if there is such a thing. Let's say our own optimal goalkeeper rotation table will be available to members within the next week on Draft FC. I'm going to have 2 versions of the table up, similar to the ones that you saw earlier on in this episode. There will be the optimal rotation, so if you were to rotate them perfectly, what's the highest scores you could get from those pairs? But I'm also going to include the average one, which in my opinion is probably more useful to look at. Now that will mirror the optimal one pretty much. There'll be some subtle differences, and all you would then need to do is during your draft is take who you think or who our rankings would suggest is the best available goalkeeper at the time you choose to take them. You can then refer to that graph with that table and look at who the optimal pairs are with that and take the best one from the draft pile in the subsequent rounds. As I say, with the bonus points changes, the new world order when it comes to clean sheets, which I'll talk a lot more about in the next episode when I talk about defenders, we have to nudge keepers down our ranks this summer. I'll speak more, as I said, in the next episode on defenders about how it seems the Premier League has really fundamentally changed last season in terms of defensive stats. But yeah, and again, if there's anything about this that isn't convincing to you, if you're looking at your draft rankings, if you've done a couple of mocks and you're looking at the way it's going, you feel like taking an Alisson or an Edison or a Raya or a Pickford in round 5, 6, 7, 8, then honestly feel free to message me and I can kind of go through some worked examples a little bit better. I refer to it in the Defender episode, but I think if you rewind to last summer, I did an episode on positional scarcity. It was episode 132, I think, off the top of my head. I don't actually have it written down in front of me, where I basically cover the idea of putting your value on draft day in the positions that matter most. And I make the case that really that's forwards and premium forwards, average forwards and decent midfielders compared to goalkeepers. And again, it may sound completely counterintuitive, but sometimes the next best pick in the draft is not necessarily a player that you think will score the highest, okay? Because of the idea of positional scarcity. As I said, rewind to episode 132. I'm going to cover it again a little bit more in the next episode, but that's really the basis of why the goalkeepers have to fall so far down the list. And certainly for your first goalkeeper pick, wherever that may be, regardless of the size of the league you're in, do not go near any team where there is a doubt over who the starting goalkeeper is, because it's just a headache that you do not need as the season kicks off and as the season progresses. So that is it for the first episode on our Road to Draft Day series covering the goalkeeper position. I warned you at the beginning this was going to be a far too over-engineered episode on the least important position in the game, but we've got this far. Thank you for sticking with us all the way. Hopefully, I've managed to sell you on the broad points if you weren't sold already. And as I said, we will have our own Draft FC optimal rotation table available for members within the next few days. The next episode will be on the defenders, and just because I didn't want to, I could have done some of this, the defender data, in with the goalkeepers, because ultimately we're looking at clean sheets, but I wanted to try and split it up a little bit. Otherwise, the goalkeeping episode would have been far too long. So in the defender episode coming in the next day or two, I'll have a look at how the Premier League really changed last year, how the number of clean sheets fell off a cliff, why that might be the case, and why, as I said, it could mean that we have to completely rethink the way we look at defenders from now onwards, barring any other changes to the Premier League as a whole. If you enjoyed this and you're watching on YouTube, make sure you subscribe. And if you did enjoy it, also be appreciative if you give us a thumbs up too. If you're listening to this on the audio, then make sure that you're following on whichever platform that you're listening on. If you want to stay tuned and up to date with all the comings and goings at Draft SC, also check out our social media feeds. The most active and relevant one is probably on X, and we can be found at draft_FC. This is probably also the most reliable way to get hold of me. I'm always responsive in the DMs in there. I know a few of you also reach out on Instagram. We've got an Instagram feed. And those of you who are active in the Draft Premier League Reddit thread, I know also reach out to me on there, which is fine. And I will hopefully reply to all of you, but I don't always check those quite so regularly as I do the X feed. So that's probably the best place to DM me. And you can ask me anything and say any queries about what I might have said on this video. If there's anything that you disagree with or agree with, or any points that you want to add, I'd also just encourage you to comment them down below so we can maybe spark a conversation and share some knowledge that wasn't covered in the video with the rest of the people looking and reading the comments. But I'm always happy to engage. If you've got particular players you're not sure about, anything at all to do with draft, football, fantasy, I am there to chat. So this episode has gone on long enough now. I will leave you to it. Hope you enjoyed. As I said, please like, share, subscribe, follow, whatever you need to do, review. It does really help the channel out and helps get it out to more eyes and ears, which help us grow and help us carry on doing what we're doing, bigger and better each year. So yeah, appreciate all of you that have done those things already. And I say a warm welcome to those of you that have found your way here for the first time. But until the next episode, as always, stay shook.